The third docking clamp had just sheared off the Empress's flagship, and Garrett Nye was the only technician still standing in Bay 12. He heard it go, a shriek of torqued metal that bounced off the hangar's vaulted ceiling and came back sounding like something dying. The clamp's 2-ton jaw swung wide, trailing sparks and severed hydraulic lines that sprayed pale blue coolant across the deck plating in a fan-shaped arc that reached almost to his boots. The V-3 Dreadnought Ascendant Throne shifted in its cradle, 300 meters of warship groaning against the two remaining clamps like a chained animal testing frayed rope, and somewhere above him, far above, in the observation gallery that ringed the upper reaches of Bay 12 like a crown, he heard the collective intake of breath from the watching officers and dignitaries who had come to see the fleet's pride restored and were instead watching it tear itself apart. Garrett set down his wrench. Not through it, set it down, on the edge of the maintenance cart he had been working from for the past 11 hours, next to a thermos of cold coffee and a battered logbook held together with electrical tape. He was 46 years old. He had been a docking technician for 22 of those years, the last 8 at V-3 orbital yards, where humans were hired for the jobs the V-3 considered beneath their engineering caste and above their service drones. Docking clamp maintenance fell into that gap. It was too dirty for an engineer and too dangerous for a drone, which made it perfect for a human who needed the work badly enough to not ask questions about the safety margins. The safety margins, as it happened, were the problem. Bay 12, report. The voice came from the overhead comm, clipped, precise, carrying the particular tension of someone who was already composing the disciplinary notice in their head. That would be Dock Supervisor Orenthal, a V-3 with ice-blue skin, a permanent ridge between his brows, and the expression of a man who believed that anything that went wrong in his facility was a personal insult delivered by the universe specifically to inconvenience him. Garrett keyed his shoulder mic. Clamp 3 is gone. Hydraulic failure at the primary junction, the mounting bolts fatigued through. Clamp 4 is holding, but the load distribution just doubled on it. We need to redistribute before 4 goes the same way. How long? He looked at the remaining clamps. 2 and 4 were original installations, 18 years old, designed for a ship half the Ascendant Throne's current mass. The flagship had been refitted 3 times since those clamps were rated, each refit adding tonnage that nobody had recalculated the clamp tolerances for because the engineering caste did not recalculate things that had been calculated correctly the first time. That was doctrine. Doctrine said the original calculations were sufficient. The clamps, one by one, were saying otherwise. If I can get a team down here, 6 hours to rig temporary bracing and redistribute the load across the bay's structural frame. Without a team, he looked at his hands. Scarred across the knuckles, oil ground into the creases so deep that no amount of scrubbing would ever get it out. A half-healed burn across the back of his left hand from a plasma cutter that had kicked back on him 6 days ago. Without a team, longer, a lot longer. You don't have a team. The engineering division has declined to assign personnel to a docking clamp issue. Their position is that the clamps are rated for the current load. Garrett stared at the comm speaker, bolted to the ceiling strut above him. Somewhere beyond the speaker, through layers of administrative protocol and caste hierarchy, a division of V-3 engineers was refusing to acknowledge that an 18-year-old clamp system was failing under a load it was never designed to hold, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that 3 successive refits had been approved without a structural review, which would mean admitting that the engineering caste had made an error, which was, in the V-3 professional framework, approximately equivalent to admitting that gravity was a suggestion. Their position, Garrett said carefully, is going to drop a 300-meter dreadnought through the floor of Bay 12. Noted. The engineering division has also filed a formal objection to your characterization of the situation as an emergency. They have requested that you confine your remarks to your area of technical competence. His his area of technical competence. Garrett pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped the coolant spray off his forearms, a mechanical action, buying himself the 2 seconds he needed to not say what he wanted to say. These hands had held docking clamps together on 9 stations across V3 space. They had replaced junction bolts in vacuum. They had rebuilt hydraulic actuators from salvaged parts on stations where the nearest supply depot was a 4-day transit. And once, on Relay Station Kethes, during a cascade failure that the engineering cast later attributed to anomalous material fatigue, these hands had held a fractured mounting bracket in place for 40 minutes while the station's crew evacuated, because the bracket was the only thing keeping the docking arm from swinging into the station's hull. The engineers had already left on the first transport. Garrett had been the last one out, and he had walked off the station with hydraulic fluid frozen to his gloves and stress fractures in 2 of his finger bones from the sustained grip. Nobody had mentioned that in the incident report. The report classified it as anomalous material fatigue and recommended updated inspection protocols, which were adopted 6 months later, and then quietly shelved when the inspection schedule conflicted with the engineering division's quarterly review cycle. His area of technical competence was keeping things from falling apart after the people who designed them refused to believe they could. He picked up the wrench. The Ascendant Throne was the V3 Imperium's ceremonial flagship, not the largest ship in the fleet, but the most revered. It carried the Empress's standard. Its hull was engraved with 3,000 years of battle honors in script so fine that it could only be read from a maintenance pod at close range. And Garrett had read most of them over the past 8 years, because reading hull engravings was what you did when you were hanging off the side of a ship at 3 in the morning waiting for a sealant layer to cure. He knew the names of battles fought before humanity had electricity. He knew which panels flexed first under thermal cycling and which hull joints wept condensation when the bay temperature dropped below standard. He knew this ship the way a doctor knows a long-term patient, not from the chart, but from the body. The ship had come in 11 days ago for a scheduled refit, drive calibration, hull integrity survey, ceremonial polish for the Empress's upcoming Ascension anniversary. Standard work, performed by the engineering cast with the precision and ceremony they brought to everything. The docking, however, was performed by the maintenance division, which meant Garrett and 2 other human technicians, Petros, who had transferred to Bay 6 3 days ago when his wife went into early labor on the ground station, and Demas, who had broken her wrist yesterday when a cable winch malfunctioned, and was currently in the medical ward arguing with a V3 physician about whether human bones actually needed to be immobilized or would resolve through natural ossification. Which left Garrett alone, in a bay designed for cruiser-class vessels, with a dreadnought that outweighed its cradle by 40%, and a clamp system that was losing integrity 1 joint at a time. He climbed the maintenance ladder to Clamp 4's access panel, 30 meters up the bay wall, where the clamp's massive jaw met the mounting frame. The ladder rungs were spaced for V3 stride, which meant each step was a stretch that pulled at his lower back and reminded him that he was not 24 anymore and had not been for a long time. His knees ached. His shoulders ached. The burn on his hand throbbed with every grip. Above him, the observation gallery was bright with dignitary silhouettes, pale V3 faces pressed to the crystal panels, watching the maintenance technician climb the way spectators watch a man working on a high beam, with interest, detached concern, and absolutely no intention of going up there themselves. He opened the access panel. Inside was a cathedral of hydraulic lines, mounting bolts and structural bracing, V3 engineering at its finest, which meant it was beautiful, precisely machined, and utterly intolerant of any condition it had not been designed for. The primary mounting bolts, 16 of them, each as thick as his forearm, were showing stress fractures along the threading. Hairline cracks, barely visible, radiating outward from the bolt heads in patterns that he recognized from 22 years of staring at metal under strain. 3 of the bolts had micro-deformation at the base, the metal stretching under constant overload, thinning by fractions of a millimeter that added up the way small debts add up, invisibly, until the bill comes due all at once. The bolts were not going to fail today. They might not fail tomorrow. But they were going to fail, and when they did, Clamp 4 would go the way Clamp 3 had gone, and the dreadnought would be hanging from Clamp 2 alone, which would last approximately 90 seconds before the entire cradle structure came apart, and 300 meters of ceremonial warship settled through the floor of Bay 12 like a stone through rotten ice. Garrett pulled his logbook from his back pocket and began writing. He wrote fast, in the compressed shorthand he had developed over 2 decades of documenting problems that other people did not want to hear about: stress fracture patterns, bolt torque readings estimated by feel and cross-referenced against the manufacturer's spec chart that he had memorized years ago, hydraulic pressure fluctuations timed against the ship's micro-movements in the cradle. He had been keeping logs like this for years, hundreds of them. They filled a shelf in his quarters, battered notebooks bound with tape, each one a record of the slow deterioration of systems that the engineering cast certified as optimal, and the maintenance division was left to hold together with improvisation and whatever parts nobody else had claimed. Nobody read the logs, he wrote them anyway. Because someday, when something finally fell, someone would ask why nobody saw it coming, and the answer would be sitting on a shelf in a maintenance technician's quarters, written in pencil, because the requisition for a datapad had been denied 3 years running on the grounds that maintenance-grade documentation did not require electronic formatting. He climbed back down. The observation gallery was fuller now. He could see figures moving behind the tinted crystal panels, pale shapes in formal attire gathering in clusters the way clouds gather before weather. The Ascension anniversary was in 4 days. The flagship needed to be undocked, systems checked, and ceremonially launched in 3. Every hour the ship spent in Bay 12 with failing clamps was an hour closer to the kind of public embarrassment that the V3 Imperium's protocol officers had nightmares about. His shoulder mic crackled. Technician Nye, report to the Bay 12 administrative office, immediately. He went. The administrative office was a glass-walled room on the bay floor's east side, small, bright, furnished in the clean V3 style that managed to make even a maintenance bay's office look like a surgical theater. Dock Supervisor Orenthal was there, standing behind the desk with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict. His ice-blue skin caught the overhead light and made him look carved from glacier. Beside him stood a woman Garrett did not recognize, V3 tall, with pale lavender skin and white gold hair pulled back in a severe military style. Her uniform was charcoal gray with silver piping, and the insignia on her collar was one Garrett had only ever seen in official portraits and formal communiques that maintenance technicians were not supposed to receive: the twin crescents of the Imperial Household Guard. Technician Nye, Orenthal said, pronouncing each syllable the way someone handles a tool they find distasteful but cannot avoid. This is Commander Valeth, sir, of the Imperial Household. She is here on behalf of the Empress's office regarding the Ascendant Throne's departure schedule. Garrett nodded. His coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid, and his hands were black with grease. He was aware that he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been crawling through a broken clamp system for 11 hours, and he was aware that in the V3 social framework, his appearance was itself a kind of verdict about his station. The engineering caste wore clean whites. The command caste wore pressed charcoal. The maintenance caste wore whatever had survived the last shift, and that was the point. Commander Valeth studied him the way a surgeon studies an imaging scan, with clinical interest and no visible warmth. Her silver-white eyes tracked from his face to his stained coveralls to his scarred hands and back to his face without a pause, cataloging him in the span of 2 seconds. The Ascendant Throne was scheduled for undocking at 1400 tomorrow. I am informed there is a delay. There's a clamp failure. I was told it was a maintenance issue. Garrett felt something shift in his chest, a familiar sensation, the internal recalibration that happened when he realized that the person in front of him had already decided what was happening and was not interested in being corrected. He had felt it 100 times. On Relay Kethes, when the station commander had classified the cascade failure as routine wear, while Garrett was still washing hydraulic fluid out of his hair. On Orbital 3, when an engineering review board concluded that a docking arm fracture was caused by operator error, despite 14 months of Garrett's logs showing progressive stress deterioration, reported quarterly and never opened. It's a structural failure, he said. 3 clamps were holding a ship they were never rated for. One has already sheared off. A second is showing stress fractures that will propagate within 72 hours. The third is bearing load it was designed to share across 4 points. The ship cannot be safely undocked until the clamp system is reinforced or replaced. Commander Valeth's expression did not change. The engineering division's assessment is that the clamp system is within operational parameters. The engineering division hasn't been inside the clamp junction. I have. I was inside it 20 minutes ago. I can describe every stress fracture on every bolt. You are a maintenance technician. Yes, ma'am. I'm the one who sees what happens after the parameters stop being operational. Silence. Orenthal's pale blue bioluminescent markings along his temples flickered, the V-theory equivalent of a flinch. Commander Valeth's lavender skin showed no such tell, but her eyes, luminous silver-white, the kind that made humans think of winter moons seen through ice, narrowed by a fraction that Garrett had learned to read as reassessment. The Empress arrives in 3 days, she said. The flagship launches in 3 days. What are you proposing? Garrett reached into his back pocket and pulled out the logbook. He set it on Orenthal's clean desk, where it left a faint smear of hydraulic fluid on the white surface, a small desecration that Orenthal tracked with visible displeasure, as though the fluid itself had opinions about where it belonged. I'm proposing that somebody read this. Commander Valeth picked it up. She opened it to a random page. Garrett watched her eyes move across his handwriting, small, dense, precise despite the pencil and the vibration of working on a live docking system. She turned a page, then another, then 3 more. Her expression shifted by increments too small for most people to read, but Garrett had spent 8 years watching V-theory faces the way he watched metal, for the small changes that preceded the large ones. The shift was from dismissal to attention. She closed the logbook. Supervisor Orenthal, have the engineering division review this data. Commander, the engineering division has already assessed. Have them review this data. Tonight, I want their assessment of Technician Nye's stress readings compared to their operational parameters by 0600. Orenthal's jaw tightened. The order had bypassed him, his division, and the chain of administrative protocol that normally insulated the engineering cast from having to respond to maintenance-level observations. He nodded once stiffly and left the room with the posture of a man retreating from a loss he intended to relitigate at a more convenient time. Commander Valeth looked at Garrett. Stay in the bay tonight. If the clamp situation changes before the engineers respond, I want to know immediately, not through the supervisor, directly. She handed him a comm frequency chip, a small crystal shard that he recognized as a household guard direct channel. He could feel what it represented not in grams, but in the distance it collapsed between his station and hers. Yes, ma'am. She left. Garrett stood alone in the administrative office, holding the chip, and looked at the hydraulic fluid smear his logbook had left on Orenthal's pristine desk. He did not clean it up. He went back to work. 3 hours later, at 2200, The lights in Bay 12 cycled down to their dim night shift setting, and Garrett found out what a 300-meter warship sounds like when nobody else is listening. It creaked, not the dramatic groaning of the clamp failure. This was quieter, more intimate. The hull expanding and contracting with microthermal shifts, the cradle settling against its supports, the two remaining clamps adjusting to the asymmetric load distribution with small, irregular sounds that Garrett tracked the way a parent tracks a sleeping child's breathing, automatically, from a place deeper than conscious thought, listening for the change in rhythm that means something has shifted. He walked the bay floor in slow circuits, checking the portable stress gauges he had mounted on clamps 2 and 4. The numbers were holding, but holding was not the same as stable. Clamp 2's readings showed a slow upward drift in lateral stress, not critical yet, but trending in a direction that had a destination, and the destination was the same place Clamp 3 had already arrived. He wrote the readings in his logbook, timed, dated, every 30 minutes. The notebook was filling up faster than usual. At 23:30, the emergency lighting in Bay 12's north corridor failed. The corridor went dark, a stretch of blackness between the bay floor and the decommissioned storage area where Bay 8's salvage parts were stored. Garrett found a portable flood lamp in the maintenance closet, discovered that its power cell was at 11%, and carried it anyway because the alternative was navigating a dark corridor in a station where the floor grating had been designed for V3 feet and contained gaps that a human boot could catch in if you were not paying attention. He made the walk to Bay 8 storage area in 12 minutes, selected the hydraulic fittings he would need if his improvised plan came together, and carried the first load back on his shoulder, 40 kilos of brass and steel, 15-minute walk each way, in a corridor lit by a lamp that was flickering toward dead. He made the trip 4 times. By the end of the 4th trip, the lamp had given up entirely, and he walked the last stretch in darkness, navigating by the sound of Bay 12's ventilation system and the faint vibration of the dreadnought's hull transmitted through the deck plating. Nobody saw any of this. Nobody was there to see it. That was the nature of maintenance work. It happened in the margins, in the hours between shifts, in the spaces the rest of the station treated as infrastructure rather than workplace. The work was invisible until it failed, and the people who did it were invisible unless they failed too. At midnight, the portable gauge on Clamp 2 spiked. Garrett was halfway through sorting the salvaged fittings on the bay floor, laying them out in the order he would need them, the way a surgeon lays out instruments, when the gauge's alarm tone cut through the bay's low hum. A thin, insistent chirp that he felt in his teeth before he heard it with his ears. He dropped the fitting he was holding and crossed the bay floor at a run, which was not something he did often because running in a maintenance bay with scattered tools and uneven deck plating was a good way to end a career face-down. But the gauge did not chirp unless lateral stress exceeded the caution threshold, and the caution threshold was the last line before the bolts started stretching in real time. The reading was 9% above the caution mark, not catastrophic, not yet. But it had jumped in a single interval. 30 minutes ago it had been tracking a slow, predictable climb, and now it had leaped, which meant something had shifted in the load distribution. Garrett pressed his hand flat against Clamp 2's mounting plate and felt what the gauge was measuring, a vibration, deep and irregular, traveling through the metal like a pulse through a vein. The ship was settling. The asymmetric load from the lost clamp was finding new paths through the cradle structure, and some of those paths ran through connection points that were never designed to carry them. He climbed the maintenance ladder again. 30 meters, V3 spaced rungs, burning hand, aching knees, the whole catalog of small pains that his body had been filing under postponed for the last 15 hours. Inside the Clamp 2 junction, he found what he expected and did not want to find. The upper row of mounting bolts had developed a visible lean. Not fractures, not yet, but deformation under sustained asymmetric load. The bolts were bending toward the direction the lost clamp used to oppose, tilting by perhaps half a degree, invisible to anyone who had not spent 22 years reading the body language of fasteners under stress. He could not fix this now. He did not have the replacement bolts, and even if he did, unbolting a load-bearing clamp on a live cradle with no backup was the kind of decision that ended with a 300-meter warship and a maintenance technician occupying the same space on the bay floor. What he could do was buy time. He rigged a lateral tension cable from the clamp housing to a structural I-beam in the bay wall, a crude counterpull, using a cargo strap he had brought from Bay 8's pile and a carabiner from his own tool belt. It would not fix the lean. It would slow the progression, the way a tourniquet does not fix a wound but keeps a man alive until someone can. He torqued the strap until the gauge reading dropped back to 7% above caution and held there. Not safe. Less dangerous than it had been 10 minutes ago. The distinction mattered. He climbed back down, added the gauge readings to his logbook with a notation about the lateral cable, and went back to sorting fittings. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from the sustained physical effort of climbing, gripping, torquing, and carrying heavy loads for 16 consecutive hours on no food, cold coffee, and a body that was 46 years old and had been asking politely for a rest since about hour 9. He ate a ration bar from the bottom of his tool bag, stale, the wrapper cracked, the bar itself the approximate texture and flavor of compressed sawdust with ambitions. He had bought a case of them 8 months ago from a human supply depot that serviced transit workers, and they were the only food available in Bay 12, because the station's meal service did not extend to maintenance bays during night shift. The V-theory considered it unnecessary. Maintenance technicians were expected to eat during designated break periods, and designated break periods did not exist during emergency operations, because emergency operations were, by definition, the absence of routine, and routine was where the breaks lived. He finished the ration bar, drank the last of the cold coffee, and went back to work. The clock on the bay wall read 00:45. He had been awake for 21 hours. The flagship's departure deadline was in approximately 61 hours. Somewhere in the gap between those two numbers was the version of this problem that either got solved or didn't, and the only variable in the equation was how much one man could do with his hands and a shelf of rejected parts before the math caught up. At 0100, the engineering division's preliminary response arrived on his tablet, not the full analysis Commander Valeth had demanded, but a status update. The engineering team assigned to review his data had flagged 3 of his stress readings as inconsistent with theoretical load models, and was requesting clarification on his measurement methodology. Garrett read the request twice. His measurement methodology was a calibrated hand gauge and 22 years of experience. He typed a one-line response. Methodology is direct measurement. The metal doesn't care about the model. Then he deleted it and typed instead, readings taken with standard portable stress gauge, model designation in logbook margin notes. Calibration verified against Bay 6 reference gauge at last quarterly check. Because professionalism, unlike the first aid kit, was something he could restock on his own. The full engineering response came at 0545, 15 minutes ahead of Commander Valeth's deadline, which told Garrett they had been working through the night and resented every minute of it. It was delivered in person by Senior Engineer Cale Thyrus, a tall, angular V-theory with silver-white skin, and the precisely calibrated expression of a man about to concede a technical point, while making it clear that the concession reflected poorly on everyone except himself. Garrett was under clamp 4 when Thyrus arrived, lying on his back on the maintenance crawler with his head inside the junction housing, retorquing mounting bolts by feel because the calibrated torque driver had been requisitioned by Bay 6 3 months ago and never returned. He heard the crisp footsteps, the unmistakable sound of boots that had never touched coolant and slid out. Technician Nye. Thyras looked at him the way one might look at a piece of equipment that had unexpectedly started issuing technical assessments. Your stress readings are consistent with our data. Garrett waited. There was always more when an engineer conceded ground. The clamp system is experiencing load-induced fatigue beyond its original design parameters. The engineering division's prior assessment was based on the manufacturer's rated specifications, which assumed a static load profile that no longer reflects the vessel's current displacement after 3 successive refits. Translation: the clamps were failing, exactly as Garrett had been documenting for 14 months, and the engineers had been reading the manual instead of looking at the metal. We will require a structural reinforcement plan before the ship can be safely undocked. The engineering division will design the solution. You will. Thyras paused, and the internal struggle played out behind those luminous ice-blue eyes. You will implement the reinforcement under engineering supervision. How long does your design phase take? The modeling alone will require 48 hours for proper simulation, material selection, and peer review. You have 36. The Empress arrives in 3 days and the ship launches in 3. That leaves me 12 hours to do the actual work. Thyras's expression hardened. The engineering division does not compress its review process. Then the ship doesn't launch, and the Empress's ascension anniversary happens without her flagship. That's your call, not mine. Thyras stood perfectly still for 6 counted seconds, his jaw markings cycling through amber to a mottled color Garrett had not seen before, the V-theory equivalent of a man swallowing something that tasted like his own professional certainty. Then he turned and walked away without another word. 31 hours. That was what Garrett had to hold the bay together while the engineers modeled and simulated and peer-reviewed their way to a solution. He already knew he would have to rebuild from scratch. He slept 4 hours, not because he wanted to, because his hands started missing things. A dropped fitting at hour 23. A misthreaded bolt at hour 24. When his fingers could not tell the difference between a 12mm nut and a 14 by touch alone, a skill he had possessed since his 2nd year as an apprentice, he acknowledged the debt his body was collecting and found a corner of the maintenance closet where the floor was clean enough to lie down on. He used his jacket as a pillow and his tool belt as a timer, set the ratchet handle to press into his hip at an angle that would wake him through discomfort before deep sleep took hold. 4 hours. He woke at noon, stiff in every joint, with the imprint of a socket wrench on his left thigh and the taste of cold metal in his mouth. The bay was different in day shift, populated. 3 cargo handlers moved through on scheduled rotations, transferring supply pallets between the loading docks and the station's internal logistics system. A pair of electrical technicians worked on a panel in the south wall, routine maintenance on a lighting circuit, unrelated to the docking crisis, proceeding on schedule because routine maintenance had its own bureaucratic momentum and nobody had thought to redirect the workforce. Garrett watched them work from across the bay while he ate his 2nd ration bar. They were V-theory, both of them, and they worked with the precise, unhurried competence of people who had the right tools, the right parts, and a schedule that somebody had built with their actual needs in mind. Their tool cart was stocked. Their replacement components were packaged in factory-sealed containers. Their work order had been approved, requisitioned, and resourced through a system that functioned the way systems were supposed to function, efficiently, predictably, and in advance of need. Garrett's work order was written in pencil in a logbook nobody had read, and his replacement components were sitting in a decommission pile in Bay 8, where he had salvaged them from equipment that the station had classified as disposed. He spent the afternoon running continuous monitoring on the clamps. Every 30 minutes he climbed the ladder, inspected the lateral cable on clamp 2, checked the bolt lean, read the stress gauge, and climbed back down. Every 30 minutes he wrote the numbers in his logbook. The readings were stable. His cable rig was holding the deformation in check, but stable meant holding at a level that was already past the safe operating margin. He was not fixing the problem. He was negotiating with it, buying hours the way a man with an empty wallet buys time by moving money between accounts that are all equally short. At 1400, a maintenance requisition appeared on his tablet, routed from the engineering division, cossined by Thyrus. It authorized the release of 6 standard-grade mounting bolts from the station's central supply depot. Not the bolts Garrett needed, those were rated for 3 times the sheer load of what the requisition offered, but standard-grade bolts, the kind used for secondary structural connections in non-critical systems. The engineering division was providing what it was willing to provide, not what the situation required. Garrett read the requisition, noted the bolt specifications, and walked to the supply depot to pick them up. He could use them, not for the primary mounts, they would shear under the current load within a week, but as secondary anchor points for the bracing struts he was already planning in his head. Every piece of hardware was a piece of the puzzle, even the wrong-sized pieces. The supply depot was on level 3, a 20-minute walk through corridors that Garrett navigated by the particular echo each stretch made under his boots. The depot clerk, a young V3 with the professional demeanor of someone who had been trained to distribute materiel, and did not particularly care what it was for or who was asking, processed the requisition without comment. She did not ask why a maintenance technician was picking up structural bolts for a docking bay that 3 layers of engineering hierarchy had declined to take seriously. She did not ask because the requisition had a valid authorization code and a cossined approval, and in the V3 administrative framework, the authorization code was the beginning and the end of the conversation. What the bolts were for, what they would be used to save, and whether the man standing at her counter had been awake for 26 of the last 30 hours, none of that lived in the fields the system tracked. Garrett carried the bolts back to Bay 12 in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. 6 bolts, 4 kilos. He added them to the growing inventory on the bay floor, the salvaged fittings from Bay 8, the cargo strap and carabiner already in use on Clamp 2's lateral cable, a hand level, a plasma cutter that pulled to the left, a hand drill, and the roll of industrial cable ties that would, in approximately 12 hours, become the most structurally important fasteners in Bay 12. At 1600, he got a call from Dumas. She was still in the medical ward, her broken wrist immobilized in a brace that the V3 physician had reluctantly agreed was medically appropriate for human bone density. Her voice on the shoulder mic was flat and steady, the voice of a woman who was accustomed to working through worse than a broken wrist and resented being told she couldn't. How bad is it? Clamp 3 is gone. 2 and 4 are holding, but 4's trending. I've got a lateral cable on 2 buying time. Engineering's modeling a reinforcement plan. They'll give you something you can't build. Garrett smiled, the small reflexive expression of a man hearing his own assessment confirmed by someone who understood the system the same way he did, from the inside, looking up. Probably. You need me down there. You need your wrist to heal. Garrett, I can hold a light. I can hand you fittings. I can read gauges while you're 30 meters up and can't see the display. He was quiet for a moment. She was right. An extra pair of eyes on the gauges while he worked inside the clamp junctions would cut his ladder trips in half. A second person in the bay during the overnight shift would be the difference between working safely and working alone in a maintenance bay with active structural failure was the kind of risk that the safety regulations, the ones that nobody enforced for the maintenance division, were specifically designed to prevent. Can you get medical release? I told Dr. Vethani that human bones bear weight 3 days post-immobilization. She looked at me like I was describing folk medicine. She said she'd review the literature. That means no. That means I'll be down there at 2200, whether she reviews it or not. Dumas arrived at 22:15, her left wrist in a rigid brace, her right hand carrying a portable flood lamp with a full charge. She looked at the lateral cable on clamp 2, the sorted fittings on the bay floor, and the maintenance cart where Garrett's logbook lay open next to the empty thermos and the electrical tape. "You've been up here alone this whole time. Petros is on ground station. You were in medical. The division didn't send anyone." Garrett shrugged, a motion he used sparingly, because it was the gesture of a man admitting something he preferred to address through action rather than acknowledgement. "The division's position is that the clamps are rated for the current load." Damas stared at him. She was 38 years old, built lean and strong the way long-term maintenance workers get, not gym muscle but job muscle, the kind that comes from years of climbing, hauling, and gripping in positions the human body was not designed to hold. Her dark hair was cropped short because hair got caught in things, and her expression had the particular quality of controlled anger that Garrett recognized from every maintenance technician he had ever worked with who had been asked to do more with less for longer than was reasonable. "Tell me what you need," she said. He told her. She listened. Then she picked up a fitting from the sorted pile on the floor, turned it in her right hand with the assessing grip of someone who had handled 10,000 pieces of hardware and could tell by weight and surface texture whether one was worth using, and said, "This is from Bay 8. 3 years of quiet salvaging." Her mouth twitched, not a smile, but the expression that maintenance workers use when they recognize the particular resourcefulness that comes from institutional neglect. Smart. They worked together through the evening. Damas held the flood lamp while Garrett made 2 more inspection climbs, her voice calling gauge readings up to him from the bay floor in the steady cadence of someone who had been doing this work for 16 years and did not need to be told what numbers mattered. They pre-staged the salvaged materials in order of assembly, ran load calculations on the hand-filed orifice plates, and tested the hydraulic fittings for seal integrity using water from the bay's cleaning supply, an improvised pressure test that no engineering manual would endorse, and that both of them had used dozens of times. At 2300, Damas looked at the sorted inventory and the crude sketches Garrett had been making in his logbook margins, the bracing configurations he was already designing before the engineering plans arrived, and said, "They're going to give you something that doesn't fit. I know. And you're going to build it anyway with this." She gestured at the pile, the salvaged fittings, the standard-grade bolts, the cargo straps, the cable ties, the hand tools. "With all of this. That's the job." She looked at him, a look that held something more complicated than professional respect and less dramatic than admiration. The look of one worker recognizing another worker who had been carrying a load that should have been distributed across a team and had not complained because complaining required an audience, and there had never been one. "Yeah," she said, "it is." The reinforcement plans arrived 31 hours later. They were elegant, precise, and completely impractical. Garrett read them on his battered tablet at 2 in the morning, sitting on the maintenance cart while Bay 12 hummed around him. The plans called for fabricated titanium out, bracing struts custom-milled to tolerances that the station's machine shop could produce in about 4 days, not the 12 hours he had. They called for a hydraulic bypass requiring components in a warehouse on the V3 homeworld, 14 transit hours away. They called for a team of 6 qualified structural engineers to oversee installation. Garrett's team consisted of himself, a wrench, a shelf of denied requisition forms, and whatever was left in Bay 8's decommission pile. He stared at the plans for 10 minutes, not in frustration. Frustration was a luxury he had stopped affording himself years ago, somewhere around the 3rd station posting where his reports were filed and forgotten. He stared in assessment. The engineering was sound. The gap between the engineering and the real world was where Garrett Nye had lived his entire career. He scrolled through the material specifications. The titanium alloy bracing struts alone would require 16 hours of machining, plus cooling and inspection time, and the station's machine shop ran a single shift and closed for a 4-hour maintenance cycle every 36 hours, a cycle that happened to fall directly across the window he needed. He could request an emergency override on the shop schedule. The request would route through the facility's coordinator, who would route it through the engineering division for approval, and the engineering division would approve it in their own time, which was a phrase that in V3 administrative language meant whenever we find it convenient to remember you asked. The hydraulic bypass components were even worse. The engineering plans specified 3 precision ground flow regulators, components manufactured on the homeworld to tolerances measured in microns. Garrett had never seen one in person. He had seen their function performed by a brass fitting, a hand-filed orifice plate, and a section of medical-grade tubing borrowed from a decommissioned surgical unit. On relay station Kethy's, that combination had regulated hydraulic flow in a damaged docking arm for 11 months, while the replacement regulators sat in a procurement queue. The brass fitting was still in service when Garrett left the station. The regulators were still in the queue. That was the thing about engineering specifications. They described the ideal version of a problem solution. The version that existed in a universe where every component was available, every tool was calibrated, every worker was rested and fed, and had a full team behind them. Garrett did not live in that universe. He lived in the one where the first aid kit was empty, and the cargo lift was down for service during an emergency, and the only food in the bay was a stale ration bar from a cracked wrapper. The specifications were a map of a country he could see from a distance, but had never been allowed to enter. His country was the one next to it, the one with the same terrain but worse roads, where you navigated by the feel of the ground under your boots. He closed the tablet, opened his logbook, and started writing. Not notes this time. A plan, his plan, built from what he actually had. He sketched bracing configurations that used existing structural members as anchor points rather than custom struts. He calculated load transfers against the stress readings he had been collecting for 14 months and could recite the way other men recited their children's birthdays, not because he had memorized them on purpose, but because he had lived inside them for so long that they had become part of his thinking. He designed a hydraulic redistribution network from the cannibalized fittings he had hauled from Bay 8. 3 years of quietly salvaging parts that nobody wanted had given him a private inventory that no requisition system tracked, a maintenance technician's insurance, denominated not in credits but in brass and steel, and the certainty that someday the system would need what it had refused to provide. 2 hours to finish the plan. It used industrial cable ties in 3 places where the engineering plans called for precision clamps, and a folded steel shim cut from a ventilation panel where they called for a machined spacer plate. It would not pass a V3 engineering review. It would work. He keyed the household guard frequency. Commander Valeth, this is Technician Nye. I have a reinforcement plan that can be implemented in 11 hours using available materials. It will not match the engineering division specifications. It will hold. The response came in 90 seconds. Proceed. 1 word. No request for simulation, no peer review, no questions about the cable ties. Just proceed, the word of a military officer who recognized field competence when she heard it, even from a station she had been trained to look past. He worked through the rest of the night. Alone. He cut bracing struts from scrap I-beam using a plasma cutter that pulled to the left. He drilled mounting holes with a hand drill because the powered drill's battery had died and the charger was a 20-minute walk away. He climbed the maintenance ladder 4 more times with salvaged struts strapped to his back because the cargo lift was down for scheduled service that nobody had rescheduled despite the emergency. His back screamed with each rung. The burn on his hand cracked open twice, and he wrapped it with electrical tape from his tool belt because the bay's first aid kit had been empty for 4 months. At 0430, he was hanging from Clamp 2's access frame, 30 meters up, welding a bracing strut into place one-handed. The weld had to transfer load from Clamp 2's overstressed bolts to a structural rib in the bay wall, spreading the force the way it should have been spreading all along. He had calculated the angle with a hand level from his front pocket. The weld spat blue-white sparks that fell through the dim bay like small, bright decisions being made one at a time, each one a point of connection between what was failing and what would hold. By 0700 he had 4 struts installed, 2 on Clamp 2, 2 on Clamp 4. Each one was ugly. The welds were rough, laid down by a tired man in bad light with equipment that needed servicing itself. One strut had a bow from its previous life as scrap, compensated with the ventilation panel shim. The cable ties were visible, industrial-grade, load-rated, holding. The portable gauge showed the stress distribution shifting, the lethal concentration on individual bolts spreading outward through the new bracing, flowing into the bay's structural frame the way water finds its level. The clamp stopped groaning. At 0715, the station's automated docking integrity verification ran its scheduled sweep, a system-wide vibration pulse that tested the resonance characteristics of every active cradle on the station. Garrett had forgotten about it. The sweep was a routine diagnostic, harmless under normal conditions, designed to confirm that docking systems were within tolerance by sending a calibrated pulse through the structural frame and measuring the response. Under normal conditions, the cradle would absorb the pulse and the system would log a clean reading. These were not normal conditions. He felt the pulse before the gauge registered it, a deep, bass register thrum that came up through the deck plating and into his boots and traveled the length of his spine. The ascendant throne answered. 300 meters of warship vibrated in its cradle like a tuning fork struck once, hard, and the 2 remaining clamps took the oscillation directly through the mounting points his bracing struts were redistributing. The struts rang. He could hear them, a harmonic he knew, the tone a welded joint makes when it is being asked a question about its integrity. The answer, in the half-second it took the vibration to propagate through his repair work and dissipate into the bay wall's structural ribs, would determine whether the last 14 hours of his life had been worth the cost. The struts held. The cargo strap on Clamp 2's lateral cable creaked but did not slip. The gauge reading spiked, peaked, and fell back, a sharp hill on the data trace, not a cliff. The ship settled. The cradle settled. His cable ties, industrial-grade and load-rated and visible to anyone who cared to look, flexed and returned to their set position. Garrett exhaled. He had not been aware he was holding his breath, which was a sign of how tired he was. A man who had been listening to metal for 22 years should not be surprised by a scheduled vibration test. He pulled the gauge log and wrote down the spike readings. The numbers told a story. The bracing struts had absorbed the pulse energy and distributed it exactly the way he had calculated, shifting the oscillation load from the overstressed clamp bolts into the bay wall's frame structure. The ugly welds, the bowed strut, the ventilation panel shim, the cable ties, all of them had done what the engineering division's 48-hour simulation was designed to verify and could not verify in time. The overnight status board on the bay wall updated automatically. Docking integrity sweep, bay 12 within tolerance. A green indicator. The first green indicator bay 12 had shown in 11 days. At 0730, the morning shift began to arrive. 3 V-Theory dock workers, not technicians, but dock floor handlers who managed cargo loading and unloading, walked in through the east entrance and stopped when they saw the bracing struts. One of them, a young male with pale green-tinged skin and the cautious expression of someone who was not sure whether he was looking at a repair or an accident, walked a slow circle around the base of Clamp 2 and stared up at the welded joints. He did not say anything to Garrett. He did not need to. The look on his face, the the slight widening of the eyes, the way his head tilted to track the cable run from the clamp to the bay wall, was the universal expression of a person seeing evidence of work they could not have done themselves, and trying to calculate whether to be impressed or alarmed. Dock Supervisor Orenthal arrived at 0800. He stood in the bay entrance for 11 seconds. Garrett counted, reflexively, and then walked to the status board, read the green indicator, and walked to the administrative office without looking at Garrett or at the bracing struts, or at the maintenance cart where the logbook and the empty thermos and the roll of electrical tape sat in a configuration that told the story of the night more clearly than any report. Garrett did not take it personally. Orenthal not looking was, in its way, an acknowledgement, the same way a man who loses an argument walks past the evidence rather than confronting it. The green indicator on the status board was doing the talking. Garrett's bracing struts, ugly and visible and holding, were doing the rest. He was sitting on his maintenance cart, writing up the installation log in the same small, precise pencil hand he had used for 22 years, when the observation gallery filled with a different kind of crowd. Pale flowing robes and silver-threaded coats, V3 court dress, and at the center, flanked by guards in ceremonial armor that threw prismatic reflections across the ceiling, a figure Garrett recognized from the hull engravings he had been reading for 8 years. Empress Vithan III. Tall, even for a V3, pale silver-blue skin that seemed to hold its own light, white hair unbound, the style only the reigning monarch could wear publicly. Angular, precise features and eyes of luminous pale gold that were, from the gallery rail, looking down into Bay 12 with an expression Garrett could not read at distance, but that Commander Valeth, standing beside her with his battered logbook open in her hands, appeared to be interpreting with gravity. His shoulder mic clicked, Valeth's voice stripped of its usual crispness. "Technician Nye, the Empress has reviewed your maintenance logs. She would like to inspect the reinforcement work. She is coming down." Garrett looked at his coffee, cold. His coveralls were layered with fluid, slag, grease, and dried blood from the burn. His hands were black. He had not slept in 31 hours. He set down the coffee, stood up, and waited. She descended via the VIP lift, a platform Garrett had serviced twice, and that, he noted with the reflexive assessment he could never turn off, needed its lateral guide rails lubricated. Accompanied by Commander Valeth, 4 household guards, Senior Engineer Thyrus, whose expression said professional funeral, and a retinue of court officials whose pale robes whispered against the deck plating like pages turning in a long-closed book. Garrett stood beside his cart. He did not move to greet them. He did not know the protocol for greeting an empress on a hangar bay floor, and suspected it did not exist because the scenario had never been anticipated. Maintenance technicians did not meet empresses. They maintained what empresses stood on. He stood the way he always stood when someone came to see his work, feet apart, weight even, hands at his sides. Empress Vithan stopped 3 meters away. Her gold eyes moved over him, coveralls, scarred hands, the wrench on the cart beside the thermos and logbook, and the roll of electrical tape that served as his medical kit. She looked up at the clamps. His bracing struts were visible, ugly, welded, shimmed, cable-tied, holding. She looked at Commander Valeth. Valeth opened the logbook to a marked page and held it out. The Empress did not take it. She spoke, and her voice was not what Garrett had expected. Not ceremonial, not imperious, quiet, clear, and direct. 14 months. Garrett blinked. "Ma'am, Commander Valeth tells me you have been documenting this failure for 14 months, that you filed reports, that the reports were not read." "I filed maintenance logs. They go into the divisional record system. Whether anyone reads them," he stopped. He had been about to say above my pay grade, which was true, and also the kind of phrase that sounded like self-pity when spoken to a sovereign, and self-pity was not something Garrett Nye carried in his tool belt. The logs were available. They always are. She studied him with eyes that saw differently from most V3. Most looked at humans the way they looked at service infrastructure, present, functional, beneath notice unless it malfunctioned. This woman was looking at him as data that warranted her attention. You built this reinforcement in one night, with salvage materials and hand tools. After the engineering division produced a solution that could not be implemented in time. Their solution was sound. It needed resources and time we didn't have. I used what was available, including cable ties. The ghost of humor that lived in the narrow space between exhaustion and absurdity twitched at the corner of his mouth. They're load-rated, ma'am. Industrial grade. I've used them on 9 stations. Her expression shifted, a fraction that on a human face would have been a suppressed smile, and on a V3 face was something older, something that carried the weight of a monarch seeing the gap between what her system claimed about itself and what it actually did. She turned to Thyras. He stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back, jaw markings cycling through amber to a deep mottled blue that Garrett had never seen, the color of professional vertigo. Chief Engineer Thyras. This technician tracked a structural failure that your division's certified assessments missed. He reported it through channels your division did not monitor. When the failure materialized, he designed and implemented a working solution in 11 hours that your division estimated would require 48, using materials your supply chain had not provided and tools your requisition system had denied. She paused with the precision of someone who understood that her words, at her altitude, became infrastructure. I want to understand how that happens. Thyras's markings cycled again. Your Ascendancy, the maintenance division operates under a separate reporting structure. I did not ask about reporting structures. I asked how a technician with a logbook and a wrench saw what your engineers with modeling software and review panels did not. Quiet, the ascendant throne shifted, a low creak, different now. The struts were working. The ship was settling into its new balance, and the sound was something Garrett recognized. The noise a structure makes when it has decided to hold. Because he was looking at the metal, Garrett said. Every head turned. The guard's hands shifted a fraction. Valith's eyes widened. Thyras went blank with the shock of a maintenance tech speaking unbidden in the Empress's presence. Garrett did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he always spoke, flat, direct, without inflection, the way a man speaks when he has been saying the same thing for 14 months and has learned that volume does not make the difference. Listening does. The engineers read the specifications. The specs were correct when they were written, but the ship changed. 3 refits. Each one added tonnage. Nobody updated the clamp calculations because the originals were peer-reviewed and certified, and in your system, a certified calculation doesn't get revisited. It's doctrine, and doctrine is what you read when you stop looking at what's in front of you. He gestured up at clamp 4, 30 meters above, where his cable-tied, shimmed, ugly, functional repair was doing the job that doctrine said it should not need to do. I wasn't reading doctrine. I was reading the metal. Metal tells you what it's going to do before it does it. You just have to be close enough to listen. Empress Vithan looked at him for a long time. Bay light reflected off her silver-blue skin and turned her gold eyes to warm amber. Behind her, the court officials stood frozen, people accustomed to ceremony witnessing a conversation that existed outside it. Thyras looked like a man carefully disassembled and still cataloging the pieces. Valith held the logbook against her chest, and her expression carried something that was not clinical assessment but was harder to name. Technician Nye, the Empress said, "What do you need?" He did not hesitate. Not because he had rehearsed the answer, but because he had been carrying it for 8 years and it had never changed. A team, 3 more technicians minimum, rated for structural work. A supply allocation that doesn't route through the engineering division's requisition system, because by the time they approve a box of mounting bolts, the bolts have already failed. a maintenance reporting channel that someone actually reads, and a recalculation of every docking clamp system on this station against current ship masses, not the masses from 18 years ago. He paused, looked at the electrical tape wrapped around his left hand, covering the burn that had cracked open twice during the night, and a restocked first aid kit for Bay 12. It's been empty for 4 months. Commander Valeth's hand moved to her comm unit. Garrett was fairly certain the first aid kit would be restocked within the hour. The Empress did not smile, but her expression settled into something Garrett recognized, the look a commander gives when she sees competence so fundamental that it forces her to recalibrate how she understands the system it exists inside. Not admiration, too personal. Not gratitude, that implied a debt court protocol could not hold. Recognition. The quiet acknowledgement that a person had been doing the right work in the wrong conditions for a very long time and had finally been seen doing it. Commander Valeth, assigned technician nigh a direct reporting channel to the Household Engineering Office. His maintenance logs are to be reviewed at the divisional level, not filed. Reviewed. Monthly. The docking clamp recalculation he has requested will begin today across all orbital facilities. His supply requisition for Bay 12 will be routed through household operations effective immediately. She looked at Garrett. Is there anything else? 22 years of logbooks on a shelf nobody visited. 14 months of reports filed into a system that treated them as noise. A night alone in a dark bay welding bracing struts from scrap, with a cracked burn wrapped in electrical tape and an empty first aid cabinet. "No, ma'am," he said, "that covers it." She turned. Her retinue reassembled, guards resuming formation, court officials falling into step with whispering robes. Commander Valeth lingered. She set the logbook on his cart, next to the wrench and the cold coffee and the tape, and looked at him. "The launch is in 60 hours. Will the clamps hold?" Garrett picked up the logbook. The cover was stained, the spine held together with tape that was itself starting to fail. He ran his thumb along the edge, a gesture so automatic he was not conscious of it, the motion of a man touching something that had been part of his hands for so long it was an extension of them. "They'll hold." Commander Valeth nodded, not the deep bow of court greeting, but the shallow, precise nod that the V-theory military reserved for equals, for people whose professional judgment they trusted with their name. Then she followed the Empress to the lift. Garrett stood alone in Bay 12. Full day-shift brightness now. The ascendant throne sat in its cradle, 300 meters of history resting on 2 clamps and 4 ugly bracing struts built from scrap and stubbornness, and 22 years of knowing what metal sounds like when it is about to give up. He sat on his cart, opened the logbook to a fresh page, wrote the date, the time, and the entry, clamp reinforcement installed, 4 bracing struts, salvage material, cable tie assist X3, load distribution nominal, ship stable, first aid kit restocking approved. He looked at the page. The pencil was dull. The paper was spotted with hydraulic fluid. The entry looked like every other entry he had ever written, small, precise, professional, the kind of record that exists because one person believed it mattered even when nobody else did. Below the entry in smaller letters he wrote 2 words. Someone read them. He closed the logbook, slid it into his back pocket, picked up his wrench, climbed off the cart. The flagship launched in 60 hours. There were 11 more systems on his inspection list that the engineering division had certified as optimal. He would check them anyway. That was the job. And now, for the first time in 22 years, someone was paying attention.